They mocked him as nothing, a frail old janitor with a mop and a bent back. They shoved him, spit on him, laughed at the silence he carried. But when the outlaws set fire to a bus filled with families, the truth no one expected came to light. Samuel Kincaid was no ordinary janitor. He was a retired Green Beret, a man trained in shadow wars, moving with a precision that silenced an entire gang. What happens when the most underestimated man in town becomes its only protector? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The bus station in Millstone had been the same for decades. A squat brick building with flickering fluorescent lights, floors that smelled of bleach no matter how often they were scrubbed, and plastic seats worn smooth by years of waiting. Travelers came and went without noticing the man who moved quietly among them, bucket in tow, mop dragging lines across the tile. Samuel Kincaid was there when the morning shift started, and he was still there when the last bus pulled out under the midnight sky. At 68, with gray hair thinning at the crown and joints that protested with every step, he blended into forgotten spaces of town. People saw him, but they didn't. His shirt was always the same faded navy uniform with maintenance stitched in thread that had begun to fray. His hands were cracked, spotted with age, but steady as he wrung out the mop, the rhythm practiced like prayer. The drivers nodded to him out of habit. Passengers brushed past him as though he were part of the building. Even Sheriff Clara Boone, who stopped in once a week for coffee, saw only a weary man filling the hours with quiet labor. For Sam, invisibility was not a curse, but a shield. He had lived long enough to know the value of being overlooked. One autumn afternoon, as the sun dipped and the station lights clicked on, the calm was broken. Engines growled in the distance, loud enough to rattle the windows before the first motorcycle even appeared. The iron vultures roared into town, chrome gleaming, jackets patched with their black and red insignia. They were not locals. Their kind never stayed long. Yet when they walked through the glass doors of the bus station, the whole building seemed to shrink. Boots thudded on the tiles, laughter cracked like whips, and eyes turned away to avoid trouble. Sam did not look up. He kept pushing the mop across the floor, steady strokes, water sloshing in the bucket beside him. He had learned long ago that staring at wolves only invited the bite. But the gang noticed him anyway. One leaned on the ticket counter, pointing toward the janitor with a grin that showed missing teeth. "Look at the old man," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Doesn't even know how to stand straight. Bet he's been here since the station was built." Another outlaw kicked the mop bucket, sending water across the floor in a dirty tide. The others roared with laughter. Sam paused, the mop dripping in his hands, then set it back down and continued as though nothing had happened. His silence seemed to irritate them more than any protest could have. "Hey, Grandpa," one sneered, stepping close. "You clean up after real men? Or is this all you can do now that your bones are dust?" Sam's eyes lifted just once. They were a pale, cold blue, steady in a way that made the biker hesitate before covering it with another laugh. Most in the station didn't notice the look. They saw only an elderly man bent to his chore, the humblest worker in a place no one cared about. But for the briefest moment, the air carried something heavier than bleach and oil. It was a kind of silence that soldiers knew, the pause before violence, the weight of a man measuring distance, exits, and intent. Then it passed. Sam lowered his gaze again, finishing the section of floor with unhurried precision. The outlaws lost interest and swaggered toward the vending machines, their laughter filling the space once more. Passengers pretended to read newspapers. The clerk behind the counter kept her head down. Life went on as if nothing had happened. But in the corner of the station, by the janitor with the mop, the echo of that silence lingered. Those who laughed saw only an old man. They didn't know that beneath the faded uniform and the wear of years, Samuel Kincaid carried a past stitched in shadows and discipline. For now, he let them laugh. For now, he remained the man with the mop. The children of Millstone often linger at the bus station after school, daring each other to press the buttons on a vending machine without paying, or to climb the benches and jump from one cracked tile square to another. They noticed things adults dismissed, and it was the kids who began whispering about the janitor long before the bikers ever arrived. They watched him move slowly across the floor, his steps deliberate, his eyes fixed on work that never seemed to end. His silence carried weight. But in the minds of restless teenagers, silence demanded explanation. Some claimed he had once been a soldier. Others swore their uncles told stories about him fighting in jungles far away, where the sun never set and men disappeared into the trees. A boy named Drew insisted he had seen a metal pinned inside the janitor's locker when the door swung open one afternoon, though no one believed him. Another girl said her grandfather remembered him from some war, but the details shifted each time she told it. To most, the tales were nothing more than exaggerations, ghost stories built around a man too ordinary to invite curiosity. Sam never encouraged the talk, but he never denied it either. He moved through the station with the same quiet routine, mopping up soda spills, scraping gum from beneath seats, replacing light bulbs that flickered until they died. The children watched him and whispered louder when he passed, but his eyes never flicked toward them. If he heard, he gave no sign. To adults, he was invisible. To kids, he was a puzzle too plain to be true. Now and then, fragments of his past slipped through. A scar that ran from his wrist to the inside of his elbow, pale against weathered skin, caught the light when he rolled up his sleeves. A limp revealed itself when the evenings grew cold, his left leg stiffening as though it remembered an old injury. More than once, the kids swore they saw him react before a loud noise fully echoed, his shoulders tightening, his head turning sharply toward the source before relaxing again. None of them could explain how an old man mopping floors could move with such alert precision. The adults had their own theories, though they rarely bothered to voice them. The sheriff once joked to the clerk that Sam probably kept to himself because he had lived too long and seen too much, but she quickly dismissed the comment when she saw the seriousness in his eyes. The bus drivers, men who had grown used to quiet dignity of long miles, treated him with a certain respect they didn't extend to others. They never mocked his slowness or his age. When Sam was near, they straightened unconsciously, as though sharing space with someone who understood long roads better than any of them. Still, the town preferred to forget. Millstone had little use for soldiers or war stories. It was a place of routine, where lives followed predictable patterns. The idea that the janitor might once have been part of something larger, something violent and disciplined, did not fit with the tidy categories they used to make sense of one another. And so they chose not to believe, telling themselves that the rumors were nothing more than children's inventions. Sam carried on as though he had no history at all. Each night, he walked home alone to his rented room above the hardware store, the mop and bucket locked away until morning. If anyone asked about his past, he would smile faintly, a gesture that neither confirmed nor denied anything, and change the subject with a question about the weather. His life seemed contained entirely within the walls of the bus station, as though he had been born there, destined only to clean his floors until time itself wore out. But those who watched closely knew better. In the sharp set of his shoulders, in the way he scanned a room without seeming to move his head, in the steady calm he carried even when mocked, there were echoes of something that refused to be erased. The whispers that drifted between the children, between the tired old men who remembered more than they admitted, carried pieces of the truth. Samuel Kincaid was not just another forgotten man with a mop and bucket. He was a shadow of wars most had chosen to forget, walking quietly among people who no longer recognized the weight of sacrifice when they saw it. The first sign of their coming was the sound, engines growling low at first, then rising into a roar that shook the windows of Millstone's main street. The town had always been quiet, its rhythms measured by the arrival and departure of buses, the ringing of the diner's doorbell, and the slow chime of the church clock. That day the quiet was broken. The iron vultures rode in with their patched jackets and black helmets, the noise of their machines swallowing every other sound. People turned from storefronts to watch, some stepping back inside and pulling blinds down with nervous hands. Others froze on the sidewalks, knowing better than to meet the eyes of strangers who carried trouble like dust on their boots. The gang was known in counties farther west. Stories of smashed windows, stolen goods, and sudden disappearances had passed through bars and sheriff's offices, but Millstone had always seemed too small, too out of the way, to draw their interest. Yet the riders slowed when they reached the bus station, circling it once before parking in a line along the curb. Chrome glinted beneath the weak autumn sun. The red and black insignia of a vulture spread wide across their backs. Helmets came off, revealing faces hardened by miles on the road, scarred by old fights, eyes that looked for weakness and found it quickly. They entered the station as if they owned it, boots striking the tile in heavy rhythm. The smell of oil and smoke drifted in with them, covering the faint scent of bleach and disinfectant. Passengers waiting for buses drew their bags closer, eyes dropping to magazines or tickets, as if hiding could make them invisible. The clerk behind the counter stiffened, her hands trembling as she pretended to adjust a stack of papers. The air seemed to grow thinner with each laugh that cracked from the gang's throats, a sound meant to remind everyone that they were powerless. Sam was mopping near the east wall when they came through. He did not stop. He did not look up. The mop continued its slow, steady path across the floor, water spreading into dark streaks that quickly faded. One of the outlaws noticed him, nudging another with his elbow. Their laughter rose as they watched the old man bend to his work. To them, he was the easiest target in the room, a bent figure with gray hair and no authority, a man who would never fight back. The leader of the gang, Rex Dalton, strode toward the ticket counter, his jacket heavier with patches and the rest, his beard streaked with gray that did not make him look old but dangerous. He barked an order for beer, though the station sold none, then demanded directions to the liquor store. His voice was a rasp, loud enough to fill the room, loud enough to make the passengers flinch. When the clerk hesitated, Rex slammed a fist on the counter, rattling the glass divider until she stammered out the directions. Satisfied, he turned and swept his gaze across the room, pausing on Sam. The janitor's silence seemed to bother him. Most men in the room showed fear, but Sam did not look up or away. He simply worked, shoulders bent, mops sliding in even strokes. Rex smirked and moved on, but several of his men stayed close, circling like carrion birds. They kicked at Sam's bucket, splashing water across the tiles. They leaned down, muttering insults about his age, about the worthlessness of a man who scrubbed floors for a living. When he did not respond, they laughed harder, convinced they had found easy entertainment for the afternoon. The noise filled every corner of the station. The gang's jeers, the crash of boots against benches, the hollow thud of fists slamming walls, all of it shredded the fragile calm Millstone had always known. For years the town had been predictable, the bus station no more than a place of waiting and leaving. Now it had become a stage, and at its center stood a man with a mop, weathering the storm with quiet that only deepened the unease around him. Passengers prayed the outlaws would leave quickly, but the iron vultures were not men who left before they had taken what they wanted. Their presence spread like a shadow, settling over the town, promising more than just noise. They had come looking for shelter, liquor, and easy prey, and Millstone had no defenses but a tired sheriff and a janitor everyone thought they understood. Yet behind the silence, behind the steady rhythm of mop against tile, there was something the gang could not yet see. The gang spread themselves across the bus station as though it were their own den. Boots thudded against benches, hands slapped vending machines, voices rose in laughter that carried a deliberate edge meant to rattle anyone who listened. Passengers shrank into corners, clutching bags and tickets, praying for their buses to arrive sooner than scheduled. Behind the counter, the clerk's smile had vanished entirely, replaced with a pale mask of someone who knew trouble had walked through the door and had no power to turn it away. The gang thrived on that fear, feeding on it like fuel, and when their eyes turned toward the old man with the mop, they saw a new source of amusement waiting quietly before them. Sam had just finished wiping a long stretch of tile near the east entrance when a boot connected with his bucket. The water sloshed up and over the rim, spilling across the floor in a dirty tide. The bucket rattled, toppled, and rolled onto its side. The men roared with laughter, the kind of laughter that demanded others join in, even the unwilling passengers. A few chuckled nervously, not from humor, but from the instinct to appease the powerful. Sam did not move quickly to retrieve the bucket. He simply set the mop aside and bent slowly, lifting it back upright with both hands. His motions were calm, unhurried, as though the water across the floor were nothing more than a small inconvenience. "Look at him," one of the bikers said, pointing with a ringed finger. "Moves slower than my grandma. What's he even doing here? This old man should be in a home, not cleaning after us." Another joined in, snatching the mop from where Sam had set it. He swung it like a weapon, making mock thrusts at the air, pretending to duel. The others laughed louder, clapping and jeering as their friend performed a clumsy dance. The mop head slapped wetly against the tiles, leaving streaks that undid Sam's careful work. Still, the janitor said nothing. His eyes followed the mop for only a second before returning to the bucket. He dipped a rag into what little water remained, wrung it out in his hands, and began to wipe at the spill with patient strokes. The silence unsettled them more than a protest would have. They wanted anger, shouts, some sign that they'd gotten under his skin. Instead, they saw a man who refused to play along, who neither begged nor fought back. One leaned down close, his breath heavy with the stench of liquor, and sneered into Sam's ear. "You deaf, old man? We're talking to you. Or are you too useless to even answer?" Sam turned his head slightly, his pale blue eyes locking with the biker's. There was no fear in them, no anger, only a steady weight that lingered a moment longer than the outlaw expected. It was enough to draw a flicker of hesitation before the biker covered it with another laugh, pushing off and striding back to his friends. "Guess he's just a dumb old mule," Rex Dalton said from across the room, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Don't waste too much time. He'll break if you push him." The men chuckled again, satisfied with the remark, but the leader's eyes lingered on Sam longer than the others noticed. He studied the janitor's posture, the way he bent without hurrying, the way his hands moved with control rather than weakness. Something about the old man's quiet unnerved him, though he wouldn't admit it. Sam finished cleaning the spill, replaced the mop in its bucket, and rolled it toward the wall as though nothing had happened. His silence was not submission but discipline, the kind that came from years of practice in places where speaking too soon could mean death. To the passengers, he looked like a man simply too beaten down to respond. To the outlaws, he looked like an easy target, but behind his steady gaze, behind a calm breath and patient hands, the calculation had already begun. He measured their size, their movements, the exits and station, and the weight of fear pressing down on every bystander. He did not move against them, not yet. For now, his role was the old janitor, silent, steady, invisible. The gang went back to their noise, but the mockery left a mark on the air. Those who watched closely sensed it was not finished. Something about the old man's stillness promised that the balance of power in that bus station had shifted, though no one could yet say in which direction. The outlaws had thrown the first insult. Sam had endured it with silence, and silence, in its own way, was heavier than any word. Sheriff Clara Boone had walked through the doors of Millstone's bus station countless times. Most days, it was nothing more than routine. Check in with the clerk, nod to the drivers, keep an eye on the young drifters who sometimes passed through on their way to nowhere. The building rarely demanded more than her presence. And in a town as small as Millstone, presence often carried more weight than action. That afternoon, though, the air felt heavier the moment she stepped inside. The iron vultures were spread across the waiting area like a storm cloud, their laughter too loud, their boots too heavy against the tiles. Passengers avoided eye contact. The clerk's hands trembled as she shuffled papers that didn't need sorting. And in the corner, the janitor worked quietly as though none of it concerned him. Clara rested her hand near the holster at her hip, not drawing her weapon, but making sure it was visible. She was a practical woman, mid-40s with lines around her eyes from years of squinting against both sunlight and lies. Her badge had weight in Millstone, though she knew it meant less to men who came roaring in from outside. She scanned the room, assessing as she always did, and her eyes landed briefly on Samuel Kincaid. He was bent over his mop, gray hair shining faintly under the flickering lights, shoulders curved with the wear of years. To her, he looked fragile, a man one harsh push away from collapse. She caught sight of the tipped bucket near his feet, water dry in irregular patches where the bikers had kicked it over earlier. Her mouth tightened. She disliked cruelty, but she disliked futility even more. Sam, she thought, was not a man built for confrontations. He was a man who had learned to endure them by keeping his head down, and that endurance worried her. In her mind, it only made him more vulnerable. Wolves always circled the weakest in the herd. One of the bikers whistled as she entered, mock salutes following as they leaned back in their chairs. Rex Dalton, their leader, smiled without humor and tapped 2 fingers against his forehead in a lazy greeting. Clara didn't flinch. She walked straight to the counter, spoke quietly to the clerk, and let the weight of her uniform remind the room that authority was present, even if it wasn't overwhelming. She did not confront them outright. She knew better than to prod a nest of hornets without backup, but her eyes kept flicking toward the janitor, wondering if he understood the danger pressing in around him. Sam didn't look up. He moved the mop in slow, careful arcs, dipping it into what little water remained. His silence made Clara uneasy. She knew fear when she saw it, and she decided that was all it was, fear and frailty wrapped in work clothes. The man had probably never stood up for himself in his life. The sheriff's instincts told her to intervene gently, to offer him a word of comfort later, maybe to remind him that it was better to stay out of the gang's way until they left town. She didn't see the way his eyes shifted ever so slightly when Rex moved. She didn't notice the measured rhythm of his breathing, the subtle awareness behind what looked like weakness. To Clara, he was part of the scenery of Millstone, the old janitor with his mop and bucket, another fixture in a town that had too many forgotten souls. She underestimated him because she had never been given a reason not to. In her world, strength came in visible forms: badges, guns, patrol cars. She could not imagine it hidden in the frame of an aging man who cleaned bus station floors. She stayed longer than she intended, her presence alone enough to keep the bikers from going too far. But she knew she couldn't remain forever. When she finally stepped back outside into the fading light, she left with the impression that Samuel Kincaid was one more fragile piece of millstone she would eventually have to protect. What she did not realize was that the quiet strength she dismissed so easily would soon eclipse her own authority. The janitor was not fragile. He was waiting. The station emptied slowly after nightfall. The last bus rumbled away, its taillights fading into the dark stretch of highway, leaving behind only the hum of the vending machines and the faint buzz of tire fluorescent bulbs. Sam pushed his mop into the utility closet, the scrape of its handle against the wall sounding louder in the stillness. For hours he had endured the bikers' noise, their jeers and laughter echoing through the building like drunken thunder. Now the silence felt almost fragile, a curtain he did not wish to disturb. He waited until the doors clicked shut behind the final passenger before moving toward the row of dented lockers that lined the maintenance corridor. His locker was a third from the end. Paint-chipped, the lock rusted around the edges from years of damp air. The metal groaned as he tugged it open, hinges stiff with neglect. Inside, the scent of leather and dust rose faintly, a smell that followed him across decades and continents. On the top shelf rested a pair of combat boots, their soles worn but not broken, their laces coiled neatly as though they had been waiting for a call that never came. The leather had cracked in places, polished long ago but left to fade. He reached for them slowly, his fingers brushing across the surface as if greeting an old friend. Beneath the boots lay a stack of photographs, edges curling, black and white images dull with time. He lifted them one by one. In the first, a younger man stood tall, uniform pressed, jaw set with the unyielding certainty of youth. His eyes, though, were the same, steady, pale, and watchful. Behind him stretched the jungle, shadows heavy in the foliage. In another photo, men crouched together in the dirt, rifles slung across their backs, grins forced with camera but lined with exhaustion. Faces of brothers, most long gone, stared back at him through the paper. Sam traced the outline of each one, lips pressed in silence, memories crowding the edges of the room. At the bottom of the stack was a single patch folded carefully, its green cloth faded but still distinct. The emblem of the Special Forces, a symbol that had once carried him into places the world never learned about, sat in his palm like a weight heavier than steel. He unfolded it, stared at it for a long moment, then pressed it flat again with care. For years he had kept it hidden, tucked away behind janitors' uniforms and spare rags. But every so often he took it out to remind himself that the man he had been was real, that his years of service, the nights without sleep, the missions buried in secrecy, had not been imagined. He sat on the bench opposite the locker, the patch resting on his knee, the photograph spread across his lap. The hum of the lights above seemed distant now, drowned out by echoes of rotor blades, shouted orders, the thunder of gunfire in places he no longer named aloud. He remembered the heat of the jungles, the metallic taste of fear that never truly faded, the weight of brothers carried out under moonlight. He remembered orders followed without question, and the silence after missions where not every man returned. For others in Millstone, he was a frail janitor, a man destined to fade into the background. For Sam, the truth was different. He had traded battlefields for bleach, rifles for mops, missions for routine. It was not weakness that kept him here, but choice. He had spent a lifetime carrying burdens that no one else could see, and he had chosen the anonymity of these walls because they asked nothing of him. Yet as he slid the photographs back into their envelope and folded the patch into its corner, he knew the past was never far. It waited in silence, ready to surface the moment the world demanded it. He closed the locker gently, the clang of metal echoing down the empty corridor. For now, the boots would stay where they were, the patch folded, the photographs untouched. But Sam's eyes lingered on the door of the locker longer than usual. Trouble had arrived in Millstone, louder and bolder than anything the town had known in years. And though he did not wish it, he felt the old weight settling on his shoulders once again, a reminder that some parts of man could never truly be left behind. The night stretched long in Millstone, the bus station dark except for the pale glow of the vending machines. Sam walked home beneath a sky veiled with clouds, the streets nearly deserted. Each step along the cracked sidewalk seemed to carry more than his weight. His shoulders, though broad even in old age, sagged under burdens no one else could see. The boots in his locker, the folded patch, the photographs, those were fragments of a life most had forgotten, but Sam carried to hold it within him, stitched into his bones. In the silence of his small rented room above the hardware store, he lowered himself into a chair and let the memories come. They arrived as they always did, unbidden and without mercy. A jungle thick with humidity pressed against him again, the sounds of insects and distant gunfire blending into an eerie chorus. He remembered moving to the trees in Central America, sweat stinging his eyes, his breath controlled as he guided younger soldiers along narrow paths carved in shadows. He could almost smell the damp earth, almost hear the whispered orders that sent them forward into places maps had never marked. Vietnam returned to him too, sharper than he wished. The hiss of rotor blades overhead, the heat that pressed against skin like a second uniform, the constant awareness that each step could end in fire. His hands, now gnarled and lined with age, had once been the surest in his unit. They had dismantled explosives with calm precision, fingers steady even as the lives of men depended on each twist of wire. He could still feel the tremor of those moments in his body, though the explosions themselves had long since faded into history. His hands carried the muscle memory of saving men who never had the chance to thank him. Some faces blurred with time, but others remained painfully vivid. Brothers he had carried through rivers, across rice paddies, over mud-slick hills. Some made it home, scarred but alive. Others lay in shallow graves marked only by coordinates in notebooks locked away in military files. Sam had held them as they faded, whispered promises that he would bring them back, even when he knew he could not. Those nights lived inside him still, in the hollows of his silence, in the set of his jaw when men mocked him as just another old fool. The missions no one recorded haunted him most. Forgotten places, forgotten names, operations carried out under cover of secrecy so deep they had no acknowledgement beyond the men who survived them. They had been sent where others could not go, tasked with carrying the weight of decisions that could never reach newspapers or history books. Success was measured only in survival, and survival came with costs that never left. Those missions walked beside him even now, in the way he scanned every doorway without thought, in how he sat with his back to walls, in the measured calm of his breathing when chaos rose. Sam rubbed his hands together, staring at the lines etched deep across his knuckles. Time had made them stiff, but they were not clumsy. They remembered too much. They remembered dismantling traps, breaking locks, carrying rifles, pulling men to safety under fire. They remembered what it meant to act without hesitation when the moment demanded it. The townspeople saw only age, saw only weakness. But inside those hands lay decades of training, discipline, and survival that no years could strip away. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes. The The gang's laughter at the station still echoed in his ears, mingling with the distant voices of men who were no longer alive. He had hoped the quiet of Millstone would bury those sounds, would give him years where the past could finally remain where it belonged. But trouble had found him again, and with it came the reminder that the man he had been was never entirely gone. The weight of years pressed on him, heavy as armor, heavy as loss, and yet beneath it there still pulsed a strength that age had not destroyed. By the end of the week, the station no longer felt like millstones. The iron vultures had turned it into their den, and their presence clung to every corner like smoke. Where once there had been the quiet shuffle of travelers and the softest of bus brakes, now there was only the crash of bottles against walls, the scrape of knives carving initials into wooden benches, and the shrieking laughter of men who mistook destruction for power. The station's once plain walls bore fresh scars of graffiti, jagged vultures, crude threats, and words painted in red and black. Every spray has seemed to echo a declaration that they owned the place now. Sam worked in the background, pushing his mop through broken glass and puddles of spilled beer. His back was bent, his face calm, and his silence gave the appearance of submission. Each time the outlaws mocked him, he said nothing. When they kicked the bucket again and again, he righted it without complaint. When one smeared paint across a bench, only to sneer that Sam would make it pretty again, the old janitor simply fetched a rag. To the passengers, it looked like humiliation. To the bikers, it looked like victory. Yet behind Sam's pale eyes, steady and unreadable, a different current moved. The clerk had stopped trying to intervene days earlier. Her gaze would meet Sam's occasionally, a flash of pity quickly smothered by fear. The sheriff came and went, but the outlaws knew the limits of small-town authority. They laughed when Clara Boone walked through the doors, hiding their bottles, straightening their jackets, waiting until she left before resuming their vandalism. Sam remained when she was gone, the only witness to their real nature. They seemed to delight in tormenting him most of all, as if breaking an old man would prove their dominance more than scaring clerks or passengers. They followed him with jeers as he scrubbed. "You missed a spot, Grandpa." A bottle shattered inches from his feet, liquid running toward the drains while they roared at his lack of reaction. One knelt close, blowing smoke into his face, daring him to cough. He didn't. Instead, he wiped the floor beneath the outlaw's boots, moving calmly as though smoke and laughter were nothing but passing weather. The bikers shook their heads, confused by his refusal to rise to the bait, yet they returned to it every time. Sam knew patience was his strongest armor. He had worn worse insults from enemies who meant far more than these men ever would. But even armor can be tested, and each blow left its mark. Every graffitied wall reminded him of places where violence had destroyed more than buildings. Every bottle broken against tile echoed the sound of glass shattering in barracks far away. Every laugh directed at his silence stirred memories of younger men who once thought him weak until the night proved otherwise. He continued to work, but his movements grew tighter, his jaw set more firmly. The mop strokes lost their rhythm, turning into sharp lines that betrayed the strain beneath his stillness. He endured, but he measured, too, each man's voice, each hand that struck, each glance toward the doors and exits. His patience had carried him through jungles, deserts, and city streets torn apart by war. Yet it was not endless. The station floor gleamed faintly where he passed, but in his eyes the calm had shifted into something else, something that waited. By nightfall, the bikers stumbled out to find more liquor, leaving their graffiti and broken glass behind. Sam stood alone in the wreckage, leaning on the mop handle, staring at the walls scrawled with symbols of men who thought themselves invincible. His breath was steady, but his silence had grown heavy, no longer the silence of endurance, but of decision. The town mistook it for frailty, the bikers mistook it for weakness. Neither understood that patience has its limits, and when it breaks, it does not return gently. Eli Carter moved to the bus station like a shadow most afternoons, his satchel of folded newspapers slung across his shoulder, sneakers squeaking faintly against the tile as he made his rounds. At 14, he was wiry and restless, carrying the look of a boy too curious for his own good. Delivering papers was a job most kids wouldn't bother with. But Eli liked the routine. He liked watching people, memorizing the rhythms of the station. That week, though, the rhythm had been broken. The iron vultures filled the building with their noise, their presence like a storm cloud that refused to move on. Eli saw them every day now, slouched across benches, knives flashing as they carved into wood, bottles clattering as they hit the floor. He also saw Sam. The old janitor was always there, moving slowly with his mop and bucket, cleaning in circles around the chaos. Eli noticed things others missed. He noticed that Sam never winced when a knife blade scraped loudly against the counter, never flinched when a fist slammed down hard enough to rattle the vending machines. The other passengers jumped, the clerk gasped, but Sam's face remained still, his hands steady. Eli saw it more than once, and each time the disbelief grew stronger. He couldn't understand how a man that old, that worn-looking, could be so unmoved by the kind of behavior that made grown adults shrink back. One afternoon, as Eli placed a stack of papers on the counter, he lingered near the benches to watch. A biker drew a blade, twirling it in his hand before slamming it point first into the wood between his fingers. The people nearby gasped, but Sam didn't so much as look up. His mop passed smoothly over the tiles, water spreading in neat arcs, as if nothing at all had happened. Another man slammed a beer bottle against the wall, shards flying across the floor. Sam walked over, crouched down, and began collecting the glass with bare hands, ignoring the laughter that followed him. To Eli, it didn't look like ignorance or fear. It looked like control. He found himself studying the old man more closely after that. He noticed the way Sam's eyes moved, scanning the room without seeming to. He noticed that he always positioned himself near an exit, and that he never let his back rest where someone could come up behind him. These were details most people would never think about, but Eli had grown up listening to his grandfather talk about war, about the habits soldiers carried long after they came home. He saw those same habits in the janitor's every move. Eli asked once, quietly, when no one else was near, "Don't they scare you?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth, but Sam didn't answer right away. He wrung out his mop, water dripping into the bucket, then glanced up with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through him rather than at him. "Fear is only useful if it keeps you alive," Sam said at last, his voice calm and low. "Beyond that, it's wasted." Then he returned to his work, leaving Eli standing there, mouth half open, unsure if he had just been given an answer or a warning. The boy carried those words with him as he left the station. He delivered the rest of his papers, but his thoughts stayed fixed on the janitor, who did not flinch at knives or fists. He began to wonder about the rumors he'd heard whispered among other kids, that Sam had once been a soldier, that he had seen things no one in Millstone could imagine. Until now, Eli had dismissed those stories as make-believe, legends built around a lonely man with no family. But after watching him endure the biker's cruelty without so much as a blink, Eli was no longer certain. The station that week became more than a place of buses and noise. For Eli, it became a puzzle with Sam at its center. He began to arrive earlier, to linger longer after dropping the papers, just to watch. He wanted to understand why an old man who looked so fragile carried himself with the calm of someone who had already lived through worse than the iron vultures could offer. He didn't have the answers yet, but suspicion was growing in him. Suspicion that the janitor's silence was not weakness at all. The afternoon light slanted through the glass doors of the bus station, throwing long rectangles across the floor Sam had just finished mopping. The building smelled faintly of bleach, though it did little to mask the sour stench of beer and smoke left behind by the iron vultures. Sheriff Clara Boone stood just inside the entrance, her hat tucked under her arm, her eyes scanning graffiti on the walls and the broken bench slouched against the far corner. Her jaw tightened as she took in the wreckage. She had been called twice already this week to settle complaints about the gang, but she knew her small department wasn't enough to push them out. Now she found herself looking at Sam. The old janitor bent over his mop, as though the whole mess had somehow become his burden alone. She walked toward him, boots striking against the tile, and stopped at his side. He didn't pause in his work. The mop slid in slow arcs, water spreading across the dirty floor. Clara let the silence hang for a moment before clearing her throat. "Sam," she said softly, keeping her voice low so the clerk at the counter wouldn't overhear, "I need you to do something for me. Stay clear of these men." He lifted the mop, wrung it out, and pressed it back to the floor without looking at her. Clara felt irritation stir in her chest. the same frustration she often felt when townsfolk didn't grasp the danger right in front of them. "I mean it," she said more firmly. "They're not just loud drunks. They're predators. You can't fight wolves with a broom." Sam's hands paused on the mop handle, just for a second. Then he looked up at her, his pale blue eyes steady in a way that unsettled her. "You'd be surprised," he said simply. The words were quiet, not boastful, but something in them carried weight. Clara frowned, unsure whether he was joking or if he truly believed it. To her, Sam was a man in his late 60s with gray hair and a limp that showed on colder nights. She had never known him to raise his voice, let alone his hands. The idea that he might stand against men like Rex Dalton and his crew struck her as absurd, even dangerous. "Don't test them," she insisted, softening her tone but not her warning. "You're not built for this fight. If they push too hard, let me handle it. Call me. Keep your head down and let it pass." Sam dipped the mop back into the bucket, water sloshing quietly as though he hadn't heard her. Then he answered, his voice even, unhurried. "Keeping my head down only works so long. Some men don't stop taking until someone makes them." Clara studied him closely. There was no anger in his expression, no flash of rebellion, just calm certainty. It unnerved her more than shouting ever could have. She wanted to press him further, to ask what exactly he meant, but she bit back the words. Sam had always been quiet, always kept to himself, and she had no time to unravel the riddles of an old janitor when real threats were at her door. "You'll do as I ask, won't you?" she said finally, trying to coax agreement. Sam didn't reply right away. He finished the stretch of floor he had been working, leaned the mop against the wall, and wrung out the cloth with practiced care. When he did speak, his tone was almost gentle. "Sheriff, I've been cleaning up after men like them my whole life. Sometimes soap is enough. Sometimes it isn't." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to dismiss his words, to chalk them up to the weary stubbornness of age. Yet something in his eyes made it hard. For a moment, she thought she saw not fragility, but something steadier, something waiting. She turned away before the thought could take root, lifting her hat back onto her head. "Just be careful," she muttered as she walked toward the door. Sam watched her leave, then turned back to his mop. His movements were measured, deliberate, but behind them the patience that had carried him through so many years felt thinner now. He had given her the courtesy of a warning in return, though she hadn't recognized it. To her, he was still the janitor. To him, he was simply waiting for the moment when wolves pushed too far, and a broom would no longer be just a broom. The restroom smelled of disinfectant and damp tile, a space Sam had cleaned more times than he could count. He stood at the sink, wringing out a rag, when the door swung open with a slam that rattled the hinges. The sound of boots striking the floor followed, heavy and deliberate, carrying with it the stink of smoke and sweat. Sam didn't need to turn to know who had come in. The iron vultures had been circling him all week, and now they had decided the game was worth pressing further. 3 of them stepped inside, blocking the exit. The door creaked shut behind them, and the sound of the latch falling into place echoed like a lock on a cell. Sam looked up at the mirror. Their reflections crowded behind him, broad shoulders filling the doorway, grins sharp with cruelty. He folded a rag in his hands, set it neatly on the sink, and turned slowly to face them. The first shove came without warning, hard enough to push him back against the cracked tiles. His shoulder hit with a dull thud, pain shooting briefly down his arm, but his breath did not quicken. He steadied it, long and measured, as if bracing himself against nothing more than a draft. The biker who shoved him leaned closer, sneering. "Old man, you deaf? You don't hear us laughing at you every day." Sam didn't answer. His gaze stayed level, pale eyes calm beneath the yellowing fluorescent light. That silence, the same silence he had carried in the station, filled the cramped room until the outlaws shifted uneasily. One of them tapped a knife against his palm, the metal glinting as he held it up near Sam's face. The blade caught the light, sharp and deliberate. "Bet this would make him jump," he muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. He jabbed it toward Sam, stopping inches from his cheek. Sam didn't move. His eyes didn't even flick to the blade. He simply breathed, slow and steady, as though the steel were no more threatening than a dripping faucet. The outlaw's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of something he didn't want the others to see. "Why ain't he scared?" one of them whispered. The word slipped out almost involuntarily, his bravado shaken by the stillness in front of him. The question hung in the air, heavier than any threat they had made. The others laughed to cover the moment, but their voices carried an edge now, their cruelty sounding more like a test they weren't certain they wanted to finish. They shoved Sam again, harder this time, his back striking the wall with a thump. He didn't resist, but neither did he collapse. His body absorbed the blow, his eyes never leaving theirs. It was the kind of calm that unsettled men who thrived on fear. They expected begging, trembling, anger, anything that acknowledged their control. Instead, they found themselves staring into a silence that seemed to reflect their own violence back at them. Finally, Rex's second-in-command grabbed Sam by the collar, yanking him close enough to smell the stale beer on his breath. "You think you're tougher than us, old man?" he growled. Sam's voice came low, steady, and without a trace of fear. "No, I just don't think you're worth the breath." The words weren't shouted. They weren't even sharp, but they landed with a weight that tightened the space around them. For a moment, no one spoke. The grip on his collar loosened slightly before tightening again, as though the outlaw wasn't sure whether to laugh or strike. In the end, he shoved Sam back against the wall once more and spat at his feet. "Keep mopping, Grandpa," he sneered, though his tone lacked the confidence it had carried when they entered. The three of them backed toward the door, still laughing but not as freely as before. The knife clicked shut with a nervous snap, and the door opened with a squeal that seemed louder than usual. Sam remained where he was until the sound of their boots faded down the corridor. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulder where it struck the tile, then picked up the rag from the sink. His hands, though marked with age, remained steady as ever. He wiped the water that had spilled on the counter, his expression unchanged, his silence intact. For them, it had been a game. For him, it had been a test, one he had passed by revealing nothing. Outside, the gang's laughter carried down the hall, but in the restroom, the quiet felt like a reminder. Sam knew they would return. Men like that always did, but he also knew something they hadn't yet realized. Fear was a weapon, and he had long since learned to live without it. The restroom door swung shut behind the bikers, their voices fading into the distant clamor of the station. Sam waited a moment longer, listening to the rhythm of their boots echo down the hallway, then let out a slow breath. His shoulder ached where it had hit the tile, a dull reminder that bones no longer healed the way they once did. But his hands remained steady as he straightened his shirt and leaned against the sink. The mirror above him reflected a tired face, lined in gray, but behind the wear of years his eyes held the same quiet sharpness they always had. He stared at himself for a long moment, then turned his gaze upward toward the vent above the stalls. The metal grate was old, its paint chipped and edges dulled by decades of humidity. To anyone else it was nothing but a fixture, ignored like so much of the building. Sam dragged a step stool from the corner, the rubber foot squealing against the tile as he set it beneath the vent. With practiced ease, he climbed up, his joint stiff but his balance sure. He reached up, slid his fingers along the edges of the grate, and pressed against the small bend he had shaped years ago. The metal shifted, giving way with a faint scrape. Inside, wrapped in a pouch darkened by sweat and time, lay what he had hidden long ago. He lowered it carefully, cradling it in his hands as though it were fragile despite knowing it had endured more than most men. Back on the floor, he set the pouch on the sink and untied the cord. The cloth fell open, and there it was, a combat knife, its blade still sharp, its handle worn smooth by years of use. The initials carved into the wood, SK, stared back at him, faint from wear but unbroken. He ran his thumb over the letters, remembering the night he had cut them there, sitting by a dim fire in a jungle far from home, marking the weapon as his own when everything else felt uncertain. The knife was more than steel. It was memory. It had been in his hand when he cut through wire to free men trapped under fire. It had been silent protection in places where guns would have given them away. It had rested by his side on nights when sleep was too dangerous to risk. Every line, every scar along its edge carried a story. To most, it was just an old blade. To Sam, it was proof of who he had been, and perhaps who he still was. He held it up to the light, tilting the blade until it caught the glow of the flickering bulb. The reflection was harsh, but it steadied him. For years, he had convinced himself he no longer needed it, that the mop and bucket were enough to keep him occupied until his time ran out. But trouble had returned, louder and more reckless than before, and the patience he carried like armor was thinning. The iron vultures thought him harmless, and perhaps he preferred it that way. Still, there were limits to silence, limits to endurance. Sam slid the knife back into its sheath, tightened the pouch, and tucked it inside his work jacket. His eyes moved once more to the mirror. To anyone else, he looked the same, an old janitor with gray hair and tired shoulders. But he knew the truth. The knife's weight against his chest was a reminder that his years of service had not been erased by time, only hidden. He had not drawn on that part of himself in decades, but remained, waiting like the blade itself, sharp, silent, and ready. He replaced the vent cover, nudging it back into place until it looked untouched. Then he gathered the rag he had been using, wiped down the sink, and carried the bucket out into the hall as though nothing at all had happened. To the world, Samuel Kincaid was still the man with the mop, but beneath his uniform, against the steady beat of his heart, lay a different truth. The soldier was still there, and the first reveal had begun. The afternoon bus had just pulled away, leaving the station half empty, when Rex Dalton strode across the tile floor with the swagger of a man convinced no one could challenge him. His men fanned out behind him, some lounging against the walls, others crowding the benches where passengers once sat. The clerk shrank into her corner, eyes fixed on the ledger in front of her, though her hands trembled so badly the pen barely stayed in her grip. The atmosphere had become routine in recent days. Fear spread wide, noise pressed heavy, and at the center of it all, the janitor with his mop, moving silently as though nothing had changed. Rex slowed as he came near Sam. The old man was bent slightly, mop sliding across the floor in careful arcs, bucket sloshing faintly with each dip. To Rex, it was irresistible. He wanted to break the quiet that hung around the janitor like armor, to peel back the mask of indifference and see weakness underneath. With a grin that showed too many teeth, he snatched the mop from Sam's hands in one swift motion. "Look at this," Rex barked, holding the handle high. The old man's mighty weapon. He swung it clumsily, striking at the air like a soldier in a parade gone wrong. His men howled with laughter, egging him on, shouting for him to show the grandpa how it's done. Rex jabbed forward, the wet strands of the mop head slapping against the tile with a hollow smack. Sam stood still, his hands empty now, his pale eyes locked on Rex. He didn't lunge to reclaim it, didn't protest, didn't move at all. But in the quiet narrowing of his gaze and the way his body shifted almost imperceptibly, a different calculation began. He watched the way Rex's hands gripped the mop handle, sloppy and uneven. He measured the distance between them, the time it would take to step forward, the angle required to turn a cleaning tool into something else entirely. To anyone watching, it looked as though Sam was simply enduring another insult. To Sam, it was assessment, the instinct of a man who had spent his life turning ordinary objects into survival. Rex twirled the mop, laughing, his voice echoing through the station. "This what you fight with, old man? This how you keep us in line? A stick with a rag." He thrust it toward Sam's chest, stopping short, forcing him to lean back slightly. His men jeered louder at the sight, convinced they were watching an old fool cower. But Rex caught something in Sam's eyes then, something that unsettled him. There was no flinch, no fear, no shame, only the cold, steady gaze of a man who seemed to be waiting. The laughter faltered for just a heartbeat before Rex barked louder, covering the slip. He shoved the mop back into Sam's chest, hard enough that the bucket rattled nearby. "Here," he sneered, "clean up the mess we make. That's all you're good for." He let go of the handle with a flourish, as though tossing a sword back to a defeated opponent. His men cheered, their voices spilling into the air like broken glass. Sam took the mop, his grip firm, his movements calm. He set the handle against the bucket's rim and dipped it back into the water, wringing it out with slow precision. He did not answer, did not rise to their mockery. But as he bent to resume his work, his mind cataloged every detail. The way of the mop in Rex's hands, the arrogance in his posture, the lack of discipline in his strikes. They had given him more information than they realized. The outlaws left the moment behind, convinced they had once again humiliated the janitor. They swaggered toward the vending machines, laughter echoing. Passengers breathed shallowly, relieved that the moment had passed without violence. The clerk dared to glance up, her eyes catching Sam's. She expected to see defeat. Instead, she found something colder, sharper, hidden beneath the mask of silence. His eyes, narrow and unblinking, followed the gang's leader as he walked away. Rex Dalton thought he had won a small game. He had no idea that he had just shown the old man exactly how and when he could be broken. Sam dipped the mop again, pushing across the floor in steady arcs. But inside, the soldier had already begun to prepare. The outlaw's mistake was not in stealing the mop. It was in underestimating the man who had once turned far less into survival, and who would not stay silent forever. The news traveled through Millstone the way most things did in small towns. Quietly at first, carried in lowered voices, then gaining weight as it passed from one pair of ears to another. It began with a single voice, rough and aged, belonging to a man who had seen too much himself. Walter Briggs, who spent his mornings on the same bench outside the hardware store, leaned toward Sheriff Clara Boone one gray afternoon and spoke words that pulled her to stillness. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as though he had held them back for years. "That janitor ain't just a janitor," he told her. His eyes, pale and clouded, fixed on the horizon as if seeing something long buried. He wore the beret, the kind only few ever earn. Clara frowned, unsure she had heard right. She glanced toward the bus station across the street, where Samuel Kincaid was pushing his mop across the tile floor, his movements as steady and unremarkable as always. "Sam?" she asked, disbelief carrying through her voice. Briggs nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I'd know that face anywhere. I saw it once, long before this town. Green Berets. Quiet men. Dangerous men. He's one of them." The sheriff felt a chill run down her spine. She studied Sam more closely in the days that followed, though nothing about his posture suggested the kind of history Briggs described. He was older now, his shoulders bent with years of labor, his hands rough with ordinary work. Yet Clara couldn't shake the memory of the biker incident, how Rex Dalton had shoved and mocked him, and how Sam's eyes had remained calm, unflinching. It hadn't looked like submission then. It had looked like discipline. Whispers began to grow around town. A bus driver mentioned that Sam always seemed to know when trouble was coming, stepping into hallways seconds before a fight broke out, positioning himself where no one could surprise him. A diner waitress recalled the way he ate his meals, never rushing, never distracted, always with his back to the wall. A retired mechanic swore he had seen scars on Sam's arms once, the kind left by burns and blades, not accidents. Each story was small, but together they painted a picture no longer easy to dismiss. For Clara, the rumors stirred unease more than reassurance. If Sam truly was who Briggs claimed, then his silence was not frailty, but choice. And choice-like, that meant he could break it at any moment. She thought about the iron vultures swaggering through her town, about their leader swinging Sam's mop like a toy. She thought about how Sam would stare at Rex with eyes that revealed nothing. She wondered what it would mean for Millstone if those eyes one day revealed everything. The townspeople, however, began to see him differently. Mothers who once pitied the old janitor now glanced at him with cautious respect. Teenagers who had mocked his slow walk fell quiet when he passed. Eli Carter, with a stack of newspapers, watched more closely than ever, convinced that his suspicions were true. Sam remained unchanged, mop and bucket in hand, shoulders bent as though carrying nothing heavier than water. But the air around him had shifted. Walter Briggs's whisper had pulled back the curtain, if only a little. The image of a frail, forgettable old man no longer held. Instead, Millstone began to wonder what lay beneath the surface of silence. And though Sam never spoke of it, though he never acknowledged the stories beginning to take shape, the truth had already settled in the minds of those who watched. The janitor was not just a janitor. He had been something else once, something dangerous and rare. And as the gang continued their grip on the town, mocking him louder with each passing day, a quiet certainty grew among those who knew the whispers. Samuel Kincaid was not finished, not yet. The town of Millstone slept under a heavy sky. The streets empty, the storefronts dark, save for a few neon signs humming faintly in the distance. Behind the bus station, where weeds crept up through cracks in the pavement and dumpsters stood like silent sentinels, Samuel Kincaid moved in the shadows. He had chosen this place because no one came here at night, not even the drivers. The alley smelled of oil and damp brick, and the only light came from a single bulb above the service door, flickering weakly. It was enough. Sam lowered himself onto the cold ground and began to work. Push-ups first. Slow, steady, deliberate. His arms trembled with age, but the rhythm remained true. Each motion pressed out with control that had been drilled into him decades ago. He did not race through them. He measured each one as though counting time itself. Sweat beaded along his brow, his breath fogging faintly in the cool night air. 68 years sat heavy on his body, yet the discipline in him refused to loosen. His muscles remembered even when his bones ached. When he finished, he rose carefully, rolling his shoulders back, the stiffness easing as he drew a long breath. From inside his jacket, he drew the knife, the one he had taken from the pouch in the vent. Its blade caught the weak light, glinting like a whisper of steel. He held it low, not as a showpiece, but as a tool. His hands, though lined and scarred, still guided it with precision. He moved through drills, slashes, and thrusts, angles sharp and practiced, feet pivoting across the cracked pavement. Each motion was controlled, not wasted, the knife an extension of his will. The alley echoed with the faint hiss of air, displaced by the blade. He moved slowly, not rushing, as though reminding his body of steps it once knew instinctively. A turn, a strike, a block, a counter. His breathing matched the rhythm, calm and measured. To anyone watching, it might have looked strange, an old janitor in work clothes, moving in silence with a knife under the dim glow of a bulb. But to those who understood, it was unmistakable. This was training, sharpened by years of necessity. This was a soldier maintaining the edge of memory. From the shadows at the far corner, Eli Carter held his breath. He had followed Sam out of curiosity, padding quietly after him with his satchel of undelivered papers still slung across his shoulder. He had expected nothing more than to see the old man walk home. Instead, he now crouched behind a stack of crates, eyes wide, heart pounding, as he watched the janitor transform into someone entirely different. The man who had seemed bent and frail in daylight now moved with purpose, his knife slicing the air with deadly grace. Eli's mind spun. Every rumor he had ever heard came flooding back. The whispers of war, the suggestion of soldiers past, the calm that never cracked under the gang's jeers. All of it made sense now. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows, terrified of being noticed but unable to turn away. Sam finished the drill with a sudden stillness, knife held steady before him, body balanced as though ready for an attack that never came. He stood that way for several breaths, the silence of the alley broken only by the faint hum of the bulb. Then slowly, he lowered the blade, wiped it clean with a rag, and slipped it back into its sheath. His chest rose and fell, but his face betrayed nothing. Only the calm of a man who had reminded himself of what he once was, and perhaps what he still needed to be. Eli stayed hidden as Sam gathered himself and walked back toward the service door, his steps steady, unhurried. The boy clutched the strap of his satchel tighter, his pulse racing. He knew now that the janitor everyone overlooked was someone else entirely, someone dangerous, someone disciplined. And though he dared not speak of it yet, the sight of that flash of discipline burned into his memory. It was a secret he carried with him into the night, one that would change the way he looked at Samuel Kincaid forever. The morning bus pulled in late, brakes squealing as families gathered on the platform, clutching tickets and luggage. For a brief moment, the rhythm of Millstone returned, the shuffle of bags, the tired sighs of travelers, the hiss of doors opening. Then the iron vulture stepped forward, and everything familiar dissolved. Rex Dalton planted himself in the middle of the station lobby, his boots spread wide on the tile, his voice carrying over the hum of the crowd. "This place is ours now," he declared, his words rough and final. The men around him echoed the claim with laughter and shouts, filling the air with bravado that chilled every onlooker. One of them tipped over a trash can. Another slapped the ticket counter, scattering papers like confetti. The clerk froze in place, her eyes darting toward the sheriff's office across the street, though she knew it was too far away to save her in that moment. The families felt it first. Mothers pulled children closer. Fathers shifted protectively, their eyes lowered to avoid confrontation. The bikers fed on that fear, circling like vultures over prey too frightened to resist. They began demanding tolls from passengers, holding out greasy hands and blocking the path to the buses until bills were dropped into their palms. Those who hesitated were shoved back, luggage kicked across the floor until desperation won over dignity. The laughter of the gang grew louder with each transaction, their power written not in ink but in humiliation. Sheriff Clara Boone arrived minutes later, her patrol car pulling up fast, siren off, the red and blue lights flashing silently against the station's windows. She stepped inside with her hand on her holster, the weight of authority heavy on her shoulders. But the scene that met her eyes pressed harder than she had expected. Families stood huddled together, their faces pale. The clerk looked near tears. Rex and his men dominated the room, their presence swallowing every inch of space. "Enough," Clara said firmly, her voice carrying across the station. She scanned the crowd, searching for a way to cut through the chaos without sparking worse. "This is a public station. You can't take it over." Rex turned toward her, his grin spreading wide. "Can't we?" he asked. His men laughed behind him, their boots thumping against the benches. "Where's your army, Sheriff? One car, one badge. We've got more men here than you have deputies in the whole county." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Call for help if you want. By the time they get here, we'll already own this place." The truth of it hit her like a stone. Backup was hours away. Her county stretched thin, with only a handful of deputies covering miles of farmland and towns. If she called for state troopers, the earliest they'd arrive would be late that night. Millstone stood alone, and the gang knew it. Her badge carried weight with townsfolk, but to men like Rex Dalton, it was little more than a trinket to laugh at. Sam was there, as always, mop in hand, bucket beside him. He moved quietly along the far wall, cleaning water that had splashed from an overturned bottle. He did not speak, did not look up, but Clara noticed the steadiness of his posture, the calm in his movements, even as families cowered and men sneered. To her, it looked like ignorance or stubbornness. To Rex, it was a slight, a man refusing to acknowledge his authority. "Tell your janitor to pay respect too," Rex called out loudly, gesturing toward Sam. "This station belongs to us now, and that means him too. Or maybe we'll charge him extra for using our floor." The gang erupted with fresh laughter, passengers shrinking further away. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to step forward, to push back against the claim, but her mind raced with the reality of her limits. If she drew her weapon now, the gang could turn the station into a riot before she even cleared the room. If she waited, she risked them tightening their grip on the town. She had never felt more alone in her duty, more aware of the gap between the law she represented and the raw force standing in front of her. She looked toward Sam one last time, hoping for some sign that he would retreat, that he would not make himself a target. But he kept mopping, calm and unshaken, his silence a stark contrast to the noise filling the station. Clara turned back to Rex, her jaw set, her hand hovering near her holster though she knew she couldn't use it yet. The gang had announced their claim, and the town was unprepared to challenge it. For now, she could only hold the line as long as possible and hope for help that might not come. What she didn't realize was that Millstone's answer wasn't hours away. It was already standing inside the station, mop in hand, eyes steady, patience wearing thin. The iron vultures thrived on spectacle. Each day they lingered in the bus station. Their presence grew bolder, their cruelty sharper. Families who once came early to wait for buses now rushed to arrive at the last minute, hoping to slip through unnoticed. The clerk avoided eye contact, her shoulders hunched as if trying to vanish behind the counter. Even Sheriff Boone's occasional visits could do little more than pause the gang's antics. The moment a patrol car rolled away, their laughter returned, louder than before. It was during one of these afternoons that Rex Dalton decided to make his point in full view of everyone. Sam had been mopping near the benches, head bowed, when two bikers stepped forward, their boots clanging against tile. Without a word, One grabbed the mop from his hand, tossing it aside with a clatter. The other shoved him hard in the chest, forcing him backward until his knees hit a chair. He sat down heavily, the old wood groaning under his weight. "Look at him," Rex crowed, his grin spreading as he strolled toward the scene. The mighty Janitor King, sitting on his throne. His men laughed, forming a half-circle around Sam, their shadows stretching across the floor. The passengers watched in silence, too afraid to intervene. Even the children, who once whispered rumors about Sam, kept their eyes lowered, afraid of drawing the bikers' notice. One of the outlaws leaned close, his breath sour with alcohol, and spat directly into Sam's face. The thick sound of it hitting his cheek seemed to echo louder than the laughter that followed. "Useless," the man sneered. "That's all you are. Nothing but a rag in a bucket." Sam's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached up with one rough hand and wiped the spit away with the same calmness he used to wipe water from the floor. No anger flashed across his face, no tremor of humiliation. Instead, he looked at the outlaw with a steady gaze that made the laughter falter for a moment. His voice came low, gravelly, but clear enough for all of them to hear. "You boys never learned respect." The words were not shouted, not even emphasized, but they carried a weight that sank into the space between them. For a second, the gang stood frozen, their grins caught somewhere between mockery and unease. Then Rex barked another laugh, clapping one of his men on the shoulder. "Hear that? Grandpa thinks he's our teacher." The laughter returned, harsher this time, more forced. One of them shoved Sam again, making the chair skid an inch across the tile. Another kicked the bucket over, spilling water across the floor, the mop head soaking the dirty puddle. They jeered louder, but behind their noise, a crack had formed. They had looked into the old man's eyes and seen something they couldn't quite name, a steadiness that didn't match the picture they were painting of him. Sam didn't rise. He didn't push back. He sat in the chair, his shoulders square, his hands resting on his knees. His calmness unnerved them more than any outburst would have. Passengers who dared to glance up caught a glimpse of it too. The quiet authority of a man who had endured worse and still carried himself with dignity. For the first time, some of them began to wonder if the whispers about him might hold truth. Rex eventually waved his men off, satisfied with the scene he had created. "Let the old fool sit," he said, his grin returning. "He's no threat, just a relic waiting to break." The gang drifted back to their benches, their laughter trailing behind them, but the air in the station remained heavy, charged with something unspoken. Sam reached down, lifted the bucket upright, and retrieved the mop. He rose slowly, wiped his cheek once more with the back of his hand, and returned his work without a word. But his silence was no longer the silence of endurance. It was the silence of a man measuring the line between patience and decision, a line that was drawing closer with each insult. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that settled over Millstone after the last bus had gone, and the streets had emptied into darkness. Sam walked home along the cracked sidewalks, the echo of the gang's laughter still hanging in his ears. He kept his steps measured, shoulders square, but inside, something had shifted. The mockery, the spit, the jeering. It had pressed against the walls of his patience until cracks began to show. He knew the line he had walked for years was no longer enough. Tonight, he would cross it. His room above the hardware store was sparse, no more than a bed, a chair, and a dresser worn smooth with age. He shut the door behind him, turned the lock, and stood for a long moment in the dim light of a single lamp. Then, moving with the precision of old habit, he knelt by the dresser and pulled it away from the wall. Behind it, hidden beneath loose boards, lay a box wrapped in canvas and dust. He dragged it into the center of the room, brushed it clean with the palm of his hand, and opened it. Inside was a relic of another life, a military radio transceiver, patched together with wires scavenged over the years, its casing dented and scarred from long travel. He had kept it not because he thought he would use it again, but because some things could never be let go of. It had sat silent for decades, as forgotten as the man who once relied on it. Sam set it carefully on the table, running his fingers along its edges, remembering the countless nights when this device had been his only tether to the world outside a jungle or desert. He checked the wiring, adjusting the spliced ends he had repaired with scraps of copper. The dial still turned, though stiffly. He connected the power from a battery he had kept for emergencies, the hum of static filling the room like a ghost. For a moment, he simply sat there, listening to the crackle of white noise, his hands hovering over the mic. The years fell away as he stared at it. He wondered if the voices he once knew were long gone, if the airwaves would answer only with silence. Still, he pressed a button. "This is Kincaid," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying the weight of time. "If anyone's out there, anyone who remembers—" He paused, the words trailing into static. "I might need a favor." The radio hissed back at him, empty and indifferent. He waited, leaning forward, the mic warm in his hand. For minutes, there was nothing but the sound of static. He considered shutting it off, telling himself it had been foolish, that the world he had known was long buried. Then, faintly, a crackle broke through, followed by a voice rough with age. "Kincaid?" The word was distorted, almost lost in the noise. But it was there, a name pulled out of memory and dragged across the airwaves. Sam closed his eyes for a moment, a tightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "Still here," he answered quietly. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Thought you were gone." "Should be," Sam replied. He adjusted the dials, bringing the signal closer. "Got trouble. Not the kind I can mop away. Didn't know if anyone would still listen." The line crackled, silence stretching before the answer came. "Always listening," the voice said at last. Sam sat back, the radio humming in the quiet of his room, the weight of years pressing heavier than ever. He had reached into the past, not knowing if it would answer. Now, with the faint thread of a connection humming through static, he realized the soldier in him had never truly been alone. He shut his eyes, listening to the old machine breathe with him. Outside, Millstone slept, unaware that an old call had just been made, one that might change everything when morning came. The radio static shifted, rolling like distant thunder across the room. Sam leaned forward, his hand tightening on the mic, waiting for the sound to form into words. It had been so many years since he'd heard a voice come through this machine that he almost doubted it was real. Then it came again, faint but clear enough to pierce the haze of time. "Kincaid?" The name hung in the air, spoken with the hesitation of a man reaching back into memory. Sam let out a slow breath, steadying himself. "Still here," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the surprise he felt. There was a pause on the other end, a long stretch of static broken only by the occasional crackle. Then the voice returned, rough, older, but still carrying the rhythm of discipline. "Hell, I'll be damned. Thought you cashed out years ago." Sam allowed the faintest hint of a smile, though his eyes stayed on the radio as if it were something fragile. "Not yet." Closed enough a few times. "But not yet." The man on the other end chuckled softly, though it came out strained, weary. "It's Mason. You remember?" Sam's mind pulled to the haze of decades, and there it was. Mason Price, one of the men who had run through jungles at his side, who had slept in mud and marched under silence. He nodded to himself, though Mason couldn't see it. "I remember." Static filled the gap before Mason spoke again. "What's got you reaching out after all these years? Thought you buried the world same as the rest of us." Sam hesitated, staring at the floorboards of his small room. His hands rested on the radio, steady but heavy. "Trouble found me," he admitted. "Not the kind you call the sheriff for. A gang. Loud, mean. They've taken the bus station, frightening families, running the town ragged." Another pause. Then Mason's voice, firmer now. "You asking for help?" Sam let the question hang. He knew what he wanted, but he also knew what was fair to ask. Men like Mason had carried their weight long enough. They owed him nothing. "I'm asking if the line's still open," he said finally. The radio hissed, then came the low reply. "It's always open. Don't matter how long it's been. We don't stop listening." Sam leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly. For years he had walked alone, carrying silence like armor, convinced that the world had moved on without him. Now, through the hum of an old machine, he felt a thread connect again. Reinforcements weren't coming. He knew that. Men were older now, spread thin across the country, each with their own battles against time. But the voice reminded him of something he'd tried to forget. He wasn't entirely alone. "Don't expect cavalry," Mason said after a moment, as if reading his thoughts. "Those days are gone. But if you need a brother on the line, you've got one. Always." Sam nodded, his fingers brushing over the initials carved into the knife resting beside the radio. "That's enough," he murmured. The static grew again, swallowing the conversation as Mason's voice faded into the distance. Sam sat in the quiet, the machine humming softly, its presence almost comforting. The trouble in Millstone hadn't gone anywhere. The gang was still there, growing bolder by the hour. But the weight pressing on him no longer felt quite as solitary. He had reached into the past and found it still alive, if only in fragments. He turned off the radio, the room sinking back into silence. Outside, the night stretched over Millstone, the town unaware of the old line that had carried echoes of a brotherhood back into the present. Sam sat still for a long time, his hand resting on the knife. Whatever came next, he would face it with the knowledge that he was not entirely forgotten, not entirely alone. Clara Boone had grown used to late nights. Being sheriff of Millstone meant carrying the weight of every locked door, every anxious call, every uneasy look in the eyes of townsfolk who counted on her to be strong when they couldn't. Lately, that weight had pressed harder, each day shaped by the laughter of the iron vultures and the fear they sowed in the streets. She told herself she could handle it, that the state troopers would arrive if things went too far, that order could still be held together with her badge and her voice. But doubts gnawed at her in quiet moments, and always, on the edge of those doubts, was the figure of the janitor. She had seen him take spit to the face without blinking, endure shoves and jeers with a calm that wasn't natural. She had seen him stand straighter than most men half his age. Something about it had unsettled her, though she had pushed the thought aside. Tonight, with exhaustion pulling at her, she decided to check on him. Not as sheriff, not officially, just as a woman who wanted to be sure a fragile old man wasn't breaking beneath the weight of wolves. Sam's room above the hardware store was dark when she arrived. The door stood ajar, a faint hum drifting out that caught her ear. She knocked once, softly, then pushed the door open when no answer came. Inside, the small lamp on the table glowed weakly, and beside it sat a radio military, patched with spare wires, humming faintly with static. Clara froze in the doorway, the sight striking her with an unexpected force. It was no antique curiosity. She recognized the design, knew it belonged to a world far from janitorial duties and broken tiles. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in details she had never noticed before. The dresser drawers were half open, shirts folded with exacting precision, edges lined straight as though inspection were expected at any moment. Against the far wall, a closet door hung slightly open. Clara stepped closer, her boots soft against the floorboards, and reached for the handle. Inside, on a shelf, lay a small box. She hesitated before pulling it down, her breath catching as the lid gave way. Inside were medals, bronze, silver, ribbons worn but carefully kept. They were not the kind handed out for long service or good conduct. These were earned in shadows and fire. The names engraved on their backs spoke of sacrifice, of missions she had read about only in history books. And nestled beside them was a patch, faded but unmistakable, a Green Beret. Clara felt her throat tighten. She remembered Walter Briggs's words, the whisper that Sam wasn't what he seemed. Now the truth lay in her hands. She had thought him frail, thought him vulnerable. Yet here was proof that the old man mopping floors had once walked in places only the strongest survived. She set the box down slowly, her fingers trembling despite herself. The hum of the radio filled the silence. She turned toward it, leaning close, catching fragments of a voice lost in static. Someone was speaking, faint but unmistakably alive on the other end. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone carried weight, familiarity, the kind of connection forged only in blood and brotherhood. Clara realized then that Sam had not been waiting idly. He had been preparing. She stood in the middle of his room, her badge heavy on her chest, and felt a sting of regret. She had underestimated him, dismiss him as someone to be pitied and protected. Now she saw how wrong she had been. The janitor wasn't fragile. He wasn't broken. He was a soldier who had traded rifle for mops, silence for survival. And if the iron vultures believed they had found easy prey, they were more blind than she had been. Clara stepped back, her pulse quickening. She left the room as quietly as she had entered, closing the door behind her. Outside, the night air felt sharper, filled with the echo of truths she hadn't been ready to face. For the first time since the gang had arrived, she felt a flicker of something other than dread. It wasn't quite relief, not yet, but it was a realization that the balance in Millstone wasn't as one-sided as it seemed. Too late. She had awakened to who Sam truly was. And too soon, she knew, the rest of the town would see it too. The morning began like so many others in Millstone since the Iron Vultures had arrived, thick with unease. Families clustered in the bus station with their luggage pulled close, eyes down, speaking in whispers. The gang lounged across the benches, laughing too loudly, drinking openly, daring anyone to object. Sheriff Boone had already passed through earlier, her presence enough to hold him in check for a short while, but she couldn't be everywhere at once. By midday, her cruiser was gone, and the Outlaws grew restless again, hungry for spectacle. It was Rex Dalton who gave the order, his voice carrying like gravel across the lot. "Light it up," he said, nodding toward the bus idling at the curb. Passengers were still boarding, suitcases stacked beneath, children pressing their faces to the glass with wide, uncertain eyes. Two bikers moved fast, smashing bottles they'd filled with fuel against the side, flames licking upward almost instantly. The bus driver shouted, scrambling for the extinguisher, but one of the gang shoved him back hard, laughing as fire caught along the paint and smoke began to curl around the windows. Inside, panic bloomed. People screamed, pushing against the doors, but the Outlaws blocked the steps, holding them shut, feeding on the terror they'd sparked. Children cried. Mothers shouted for help. Fists pounded against the glass as smoke thickened. The gang roared with laughter, their boots stomping the pavement in rhythm with the frantic banging inside. It was cruelty made into theater, designed to remind the town of their power. Sam was already moving before most realized what was happening. He had been inside the station, mop in hand, when the first shouts carried through the open doors. He dropped the handle where it stood, his body shifting with a speed that belied the years etched into his face. By the time he reached the curb, smoke was pouring from the bus in dark plumes. Without hesitation, he scanned the vehicle, his eyes measuring windows, angles, and the thickness of flames. The front was blocked, too dangerous. He went for the side. Grabbing a metal trash can, he heaved it up and swung with all the force his arms still carried. The glass shattered under the blow, spraying shards outward. He cleared the jagged edges with his sleeve, then reached in, calling firmly to the passengers. "Come on, one at a time. Move quick, stay low." His voice cut through the panic, calm but commanding. People scrambled toward him, coughing, eyes watering. He pulled the first child out, guiding her firmly onto the pavement, then helped her mother through after. Each movement was precise, steady, leaving no room for hesitation. His hands, though scarred and aged, worked with the efficiency of a man who had done this before. Because he had, in jungles and cities where fire and smoke had been part of survival. The bikers shouted behind him, their laughter faltering as they realized what was happening. One lunged toward him, but Sam turned sharply, swinging the broken trash can like a shield, driving the man back just long enough to pull another passenger through. Smoke billowed thicker, flames crawling toward the roof. But Sam kept his breath steady, his movements exact. He barked orders to those inside, telling them where to crawl, how to cover their mouths, how to move fast, but not shove. In minutes, half a dozen passengers were out, stumbling into the arms of waiting strangers. He didn't stop. Even as heat scorched his skin and smoke stung his eyes, he climbed partway through the broken window, dragging out an older man whose legs had given out. He set him on the ground gently, then turned back for the next. Around him, the gang's noise grew louder and more chaotic. They hadn't expected this. An old janitor moving with the authority of a soldier, undoing their spectacle with quiet precision. When the last child was pulled through and the bus driver crawled out coughing, Sam finally stepped back, his chest heaving but his face calm. The passengers gathered together, shaken but alive, clutching one another in disbelief. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs, realization spreading that they had just witnessed something impossible. Rex Dalton stared at him from across the lot, his grin gone, his eyes narrowed. The trap had been meant to terrify the town into silence, but instead it had revealed something far more dangerous than fire. The old man had moved faster than men half his age, had saved lives with the discipline of someone trained for moments like these. And though Sam said nothing as he retrieved the mop he had left behind, his silence now carried a different weight. The town had seen, the gang had seen, and Rex Dalton, for the first time, began to understand that the janitor was not who they thought he was. Smoke still lingered in the air, drifting from the charred frame of the bus as passengers clutched each other in relief. The crowd pressed closer to Sam, whispering in astonishment, though he ignored their stares. He stood with his hands on his knees for a moment, catching his breath, then straightened slowly, his shoulders pulling back into a spine aligned with the rigid ease of habit. His chest rose evenly, his gaze steady, surveying the lot not with the eyes of an old man recovering from exertion, but with the sharp, practiced calm of someone who had seen chaos before and learned how to control it. The iron vultures, gathered at the curb, went quiet. Their laughter had sputtered out during the rescue, but now something else replaced it, an unease they couldn't name. Rex Dalton's grin faltered as he watched the janitor stand tall, the smoke curling around him like a stage curtain. Sam's stance was unmistakable to those who knew, feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced evenly, ready for motion in any direction. It was not the posture of a man too old to fight. It was the posture of a soldier. One of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, spitting onto the pavement just to break the silence. Another muttered something under his breath, a crude joke that died halfway out of his mouth when Sam's pale eyes flicked toward him. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't even anger. It was simply a look, measured, controlled, quiet in its intensity. The kind of look that made men who thrived on intimidation feel, for the first time, what it was like to be on the receiving end of it. Passengers noticed too. Mothers who had clutched their children now glanced at him with a respect that bordered on awe. The bus driver, still coughing smoke from his lungs, murmured he knew exactly what to do, as though saying aloud helped explain the impossible. Sheriff Boone had arrived just after the flames were doused, her cruiser skidding to a halt when she saw the wreck. She stepped out, scanning the scene, and her eyes fell on Sam. Something inside her shifted then, a recognition that confirmed everything she had glimpsed in his room the night before. Rex tried to shake it off, barking out a laugh, forcing bravado back into his voice. "Don't get ideas," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's just a stubborn old man. A fluke, that's all." But even his men didn't laugh the same way anymore. Their eyes darted between Sam and their leader, the certainty in their jeers chipped away by doubt. They had mocked him for days, spit on him, shoved him into chairs. Yet the man had stood in fire and smoke and moved with the calm of someone who knew exactly how to survive it. Sam said nothing. He adjusted the mop handle he had picked up again, holding it loosely at his side. His silence pressed harder than words could. Every line of his body told the truth the bikers had missed until now. This was not a janitor broken by age. This was a man who carried discipline like a second skin, who knew violence intimately and had chosen restraint only because it suited him. The crowd felt it too. For the first time since the gang's arrival, a sliver of hope threaded through the fear. They saw the way the outlaws shifted, the way their noise faltered in the face of one man's steady presence. Sheriff Boone's hand hovered near her holster, but she didn't move. She didn't need to. The silence had already done more than her badge could. Rex tried one last time to laugh, but the sound rang hollow, falling flat against the weight in the air. He turned away, barking orders at his men, but he walked faster than before, his shoulders tense. Behind him, the iron vultures followed, their boots striking harder against the pavement than necessary, as though they were trying to drown out the truth they had all seen. Sam remained where he was, posture unbroken, eyes scanning the lot. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge the crowd that had witnessed what the gang finally understood. He simply stood in silence, his stance saying what words never could. The man they mocked was no janitor. He was a soldier who had chosen to remain hidden. And now, whether they liked it or not, they knew. Eli Carter had seen more in the last week than most boys his age were meant to. At 14, his life had been a cycle of newspaper routes, homework, and slipping past the iron vultures with his head down. But after the fire at the bus, after watching Samuel Kincaid break glass with his bare hands and guide passengers out with the calm precision of a man who had done it all before, Eli couldn't keep the truth bottled inside him anymore. He had seen it clearly. The old janitor wasn't what the town thought. He wasn't frail. He wasn't helpless. He was something else entirely. By dusk, Eli was already telling the story. He started small, whispering to a classmate outside the general store. The janitor is not what you think. He's a soldier. The words spilled out of him with urgency, his eyes wide, his voice low but certain. His friend laughed at first, thinking it was another of the stories kids told about the old man. But Eli pressed on, describing the fire, the broken window, the way Sam had moved. He spoke of the stillness in the man's face, the way his hands had never trembled even when smoke filled the bus. The laughter faded into silence, replaced by a stunned stare. By the time the boy ran home, the rumor had already grown legs. Eli didn't stop. He moved from house to house on his paper route, delivering not just headlines but his own account. At Mrs. Hargrove's porch, he told again, the words carrying into her kitchen where her sister sat listening. At the diner, he leaned over a booth to whisper it to two truck drivers who had seen the smoke from the highway. By the time he left, the cook was leaning against the counter, retelling it to anyone who would listen. The janitor's not what you think. He's a soldier. The phrase repeated itself in kitchens, shops, and on the sidewalks of Millstone, passed along like a secret too important to keep. Some dismissed it as a boy's exaggeration, but others remembered the way Sam had stood after the fire, his shoulders square, his stance unmistakable. Old Walter Briggs, the veteran who had recognized the Green Beret patch, nodded grimly when he heard the story. I told you, he muttered to anyone within earshot. I told you he wasn't just a man with a mop. By nightfall, a quiet gathering had formed near the bus station. People lingered at the edges of the lot, pretending to wait for arrivals that weren't due, their eyes drawn to the windows where Sam moved with his mop as though nothing had changed. They didn't approach him, not yet, but they watched. For the first time since the iron vultures had rolled into town, they weren't only watching the gang, they were watching the janitor too. The iron vultures noticed a shift. Their jeers no longer carried the same weight when spoken under the scrutiny of townsfolk standing a little straighter, whispering in clusters. Rex Dalton spat onto the pavement when he caught the stairs, muttering curses under his breath. But even if he'd feel it, the current was changing. Fear still held Millstone, but something else had begun to spark alongside it. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but they're all the same. Eli returned to the station that night, his satchel empty of papers, but heavy with the knowledge of what had started. He slipped into shadows, watching Sam push his mop across the tiles. The boy's chest swelled with something between pride and awe. He didn't shout his discovery, didn't demand recognition. Instead, he stood quietly, as if mirroring the man he had come to admire. The town of Millstone had begun to gather. They didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if the janitor's silence would finally break. But they knew now what Eli had seen with his own eyes. Samuel Kincaid was not what he appeared, and the Outlaws, for all their noise, had unknowingly awakened something far more dangerous than they could imagine. The station was crowded that afternoon, its benches filled with travelers too nervous to look directly at the Outlaws who had claimed the space as their own. The iron vultures sprawled across the lobby like they owned it, tossing bottles, shoving bags aside, daring anyone to object. Rex Dalton sat at the center, boots up on the ticket counter, grinning at the clerk's discomfort. The noise was constant, a deliberate reminder that order no longer belonged to the law but to them. Eli Carter had slipped in with his papers, trying to keep his head down. He had been bolder lately, carrying the rumor of Sam's true nature from one end of town to the other. But the gang noticed things, and they had begun to catch the boy watching when he thought no one else could see. One of the bikers, a heavy-set man with a scar running across his chin, spotted Eli near the benches and moved toward him with a slow, hungry swagger of someone eager for sport. "What's this?" the man drawled, his voice carrying across the room. He snatched the satchel off Eli's shoulder and dumped the papers onto the floor, scattering them like feathers. Little messenger boy hanging around too much. You spying for somebody. Eli froze, his face pale, his hands trembling as the outlaw grabbed him by the arm. The gang laughed, the sound harsh and echoing. The boys struggled, trying to wrench free, but the man's grip only tightened. A flicker of fear spread across the room. Passengers turned away, unwilling to intervene, their silence as heavy as chains. Sheriff Boone was nowhere in sight, her cruiser patrolling miles of farmland. For the moment, Eli stood alone, except he wasn't. Sam had been mopping near the east wall, his head bent as always, moving slowly across the tiles. But when Eli cried out, the old man's posture changed. His shoulders straightened, his pace quickened, and in an instant the stillness that had cloaked him for weeks shattered. The mop clattered against the bucket as he crossed the floor with surprising speed, his steps measured, his eyes locked on the outlaw. Before the man could react, Sam's hand closed over his wrist, twisting with a precision that spoke of years spent perfecting such movements. The biker's grip broke instantly, his knife, drawn half a second too late, clattering to the floor. In one seamless motion, Sam shoved Eli behind him, the boy stumbling to safety as the outlaw staggered back, clutching his arm in shock. The room fell silent. The gang who had laughed so freely now stared, mouths half open, at the swiftness of what they had just seen. It hadn't been brute force. It hadn't been luck. It was skill, honed, deliberate, the kind learned only in places where mistakes meant death. Rex rose from the counter, his grin gone, his eyes narrowing. Sam stood tall in the center of the station, his breathing calm, his gaze steady. He did not brandish the knife now in his hand. He simply held it low, the blade glinting faintly in the light. His stance was unmistakable, the weight balanced, the body prepared. "You boys have had your fun," Sam said, his voice low but cutting through the silence. "It ends now." No one moved. The outlaw who had grabbed Eli backed away, clutching his injured wrist, unwilling to meet Sam's eyes. The others shifted uneasily, their confidence cracked by the revelation of what stood before them. For the first time, they weren't looking at an old janitor. They were staring at a man who had lived through fights they couldn't imagine, a man who carried himself not with bravado, but with certainty. Eli stood behind him, wide-eyed, his chest heaving. The boy knew in that moment that everything he had whispered through town had been true. Samuel Kincaid was not a frail old man with a mop. He was a soldier who had chosen silence until silence was no longer enough. And now, with one swift strike, he had shown the gang and the town that their reign of fear was breaking. The laughter that once spilled so freely from the iron vultures had died, replaced by a simmering silence that spread through their ranks like smoke. The moment Sam had stripped the knife from one of their own, with a single fluid motion hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For days they had mocked him, spit on him, shoved him into chairs, calling him nothing but an old fool with a mop. Now, with one act, he had torn their certainty apart. The passengers had seen it, the clerk had seen it, and worst of all, Rex Dalton had seen it. Rex paced outside the station that evening, his boots grinding against gravel, his fists clenched tight. The scar across his cheek flushed red as he spat into the dirt, his voice rising in fury. "He made fools of us," he growled, staring at his men. "A janitor, an old man, made fools of us in front of this whole town." The others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes, but he caught their unease and snapped it back into place with a glare. "You think we can walk away from that? You think we can let him stand tall, while people whisper that we're scared of a broom pusher?" The bikers muttered, some still shaken, others already stoking their anger with drink. One of them kicked at a trash can, sending it clattering against the curb. Another unwrapped a chain from his belt and swung it idly, the clink of metal filling the air like a promise. Their pride, bruised and bleeding, demanded an answer. Rex knew it, and he used it. He raised his voice so that even those at the edge of the group could hear. "We end this. Tomorrow, we show him in this town what happens when you cross the vultures. No more games. No more laughter. We take the station back, and we take him down in front of everyone." They roared at his words, A chorus of anger covering the cracks of doubt. Chains rattled, knives flashed in the dim light, and bats slammed into the ground with hollow thuds. They were men used to fear, used to overwhelming by sheer numbers. And Rex reminded them of it with every sentence. He thinks he's a soldier? Fine. Then he dies like one. But not quick, not clean. He learns what it means to stand against us. Inside the bus station, word of the gang's meeting spread quickly. Passengers whispered to one another, eyes wide, voices trembling. Some urged Sheriff Boone to call for reinforcement again, though they all knew the truth. Help was hours away, if it came at all. The sheriff herself sat in her office, listening to the reports, her hands tightening around her radio. She thought of Sam, of the medals and patch she had found in his closet, of the stance he had taken in the lot when the bus burned. She knew the confrontation was coming, and she knew the town would be caught in the middle of it. Sam, meanwhile, prepared in silence. He stayed later than usual, cleaning the station after the day's chaos. His movements were deliberate, the mop sliding across the floor as though nothing were different. But beneath the routine, there was calculation. He studied the windows, the benches, the corners where shadows collected. He marked where the exits were, where people could be ushered to safety, where he could stand when the gang finally came for him. His eyes lingered on each detail, as though memorizing the battlefield he knew was about to be drawn. The iron vultures rallied into the night, their rage binding them together. Chains swung through the air with menace. Knives gleamed as they were sharpened, bats cracked against concrete in practiced blows. Rex stood among them, his voice rising again and again, promising that Millstone would remember the name of his gang long after the janitor was gone. They mistook fury for strength, mistook noise for power. But beneath their threats, the unease remained, because no matter how loudly they shouted, none of them could forget the image of Samuel Kincaid disarming their brother with the calm precision of a man who had done it before. Still, pride demanded blood, and by the time dawn crept over Millstone, the iron vultures were ready. They would descend on the station armed with their chains, bats, and knives, believing they were the hunters. But waiting for them inside, mop leaning against the wall and knife hidden close, was a man who had once walked through darker nights than this, a man who understood that the rage of outlaws was nothing compared to the discipline of a soldier. Thunder cracked in the distance, the sound rolling low and long across the hills before settling over Millstone. Rain followed in uneven sheets, drumming against the roof of the bus station, sliding down the glass doors in streaks that blurred the world outside. Inside, the building was quiet except for the steady squeak of a mop dragging across the tiles. Samuel Kincaid worked as he always did. Slow strokes, water run with precision, a bucket rolling at his side. To anyone passing, it would have looked like a man finishing his shift, an old janitor tending to his last chore before the night. But beneath the calm repetition, Sam was preparing. The station had become his field of battle. He had studied it carefully over weeks of silence, memorizing every corner, every shadow, every exit. He knew which benches would give cover, which hallways funnel movement, where the weak spots in the windows would break with a single strike. Tonight, he walked the floor not as a cleaner, but as a soldier setting his stage. Each push of the mop disguised his subtle adjustments, placing a chair at an angle that could block a path, leaving a bucket in just the right spot where a stumble might slow a charging man, even noting where the slick of water would turn the floor into a trap. Outside, engines roared. The sound cut through the storm like jagged teeth, growing louder until the glass rattled in its frame. The iron vultures had come, their headlights piercing through the rain, their numbers swelling as bikes lined the curb in a snarling row. The townsfolk had retreated into their homes, curtains drawn, lamps dimmed, but their eyes watched from cracks in windows, waiting for the clash they knew was coming. The doors burst open, a flood of leather and steel pouring into the station. Chains rattled, bats slammed against palms, knives flashed under the fluorescent lights. Rex Dalton stood at the front, water dripping from his jacket, his grin sharp and merciless. "End of the line, old man," he barked, his voice carrying over the storm. His men spread out, filling the lobby with noise, their boots striking the tile like drums of war. Sam did not look up immediately. He wrung out the mop, slid once more across the wet floor, then leaned it against the wall. When he finally raised his eyes, his expression was calm, his posture steady. He stood in the center of the station, framed by the flickering lights, his shadow stretching across the floor. To the gang, it looked like defiance. To anyone who understood, it was discipline. The bikers laughed at the silence, mistaking it for weakness one final time. They didn't notice the sheen of water across the tiles near their boots, didn't see the way the chairs angled to funnel them inward, didn't realize the janitor had turned the station into a map of survival. They saw only an old man standing tall in their path. Thunder boomed again, shaking the windows, and for a moment the storm seemed to pause, holding its breath with the town. Sam's hand brushed the edge of his jacket, where the weight of steel rested hidden, familiar and certain. He had not chosen this fight, but it had come for him all the same. And as the gang surged forward, weapons raised, they stepped not into a station they thought they owned, but into the battlefield of a soldier who had already marked every move they would make. The night of reckoning had arrived. The first outlaw lunged, chain swinging in a wide arc meant to terrify more than wound. Sam shifted his weight a fraction, letting the links whistle past his chest before stepping inside the man's reach. His hand clamped onto the biker's wrist, twisting sharply, and the chain fell to the tile with a clang. A knee to the gut folded the man in half, and Sam guided him down with a controlled shove that sent him sliding across the wet floor. It had taken only seconds, but the gang froze, their laughter cut short. Then the storm broke. Two more rushed him at once, one with a bat, the other with a knife. Sam's eyes tracked them calmly, his breathing steady, his body moving with the certainty of a man who had done this 100 times in darker places. He grabbed the mop from where it leaned against the wall and spun the handle into his grip. The bat came first, a sloppy overhead swing. Sam angled the mop handle upward, deflecting the blow so it glanced off harmlessly. With the same motion, he pivoted, the end of the handle striking the knife wielder square in the ribs. The man gasped and stumbled back, the blade clattering from his fingers. Sam did not celebrate, did not waste energy. He turned, mop in hand like a staff, his stance balanced, feet placed deliberately on dry patches of tile he had memorized. The gang circled, snarling, but none moved without glancing at Rex Dalton first. The leader's grin had faded into something harder, but pride drove him forward. "He's just one man," Rex snapped. "End him." They came in waves. Sam let them. He met every rush with economy, never more force than required, never a wasted strike. A rope snatched from one biker's belt became a trap, looping around an ankle before Sam yanked, sending the man sprawling face first. A chair, angled earlier in his quiet preparation, became a shield he shoved into another's chest, flipping him over with practiced leverage. Every movement was a memory, discipline burned into his body years ago, and carried forward now without hesitation. The sound of combat filled the station, boots slipping on wet tiles, chains rattling with cracking under blows. But through it all, Sam remained calm, his breathing even, his strikes precise. Where the bikers roared with fury, he moved with silence, his control more terrifying than their noise. The mop handle cracked across his shoulder, then swung low to sweep a leg. A headlock lasted only as long as it took to drive an outlaw into a wall, leaving him gasping but alive. Sam did not fight with rage. He fought with purpose, and that purpose was to end the threat as efficiently as possible. Passengers, huddled in corners, watched wide-eyed. They had seen him mop those floors 100 times, but never like this. Each step, each strike, revealed the truth Eli had carried on his lips for days. The janitor wasn't bending beneath age. He was revealing what he had hidden. Skills honed in shadow wars, patience shaped by decades of survival. The fight dragged longer than it should have, because there were so many of them, but Sam never faltered. His arms shook with effort. His body reminded him of the years, yet the discipline held him steady. The bikers struck wildly, wasting their strength on swings that never landed, while Sam conserved his, each movement measured, each strike finishing what it needed to and nothing more. When the last man went down, groaning on the floor, silence filled the station. Only Rex remained standing, chain wrapped tight in his fists, his eyes locked on the old soldier who had dismantled his crew. Sam lowered the mop handle, his chest rising and falling, his eyes steady and unblinking. the discipline that mass fury radiated from him, and everyone who saw understood that Samuel Kincaid, the janitor they had overlooked, had returned as the Green Beret he once was. Rex Dalton stood alone among the wreckage of his crew, the chain wound tight around his fists, his chest heaving with fury and disbelief. His men groaned on the floor or slumped against benches, their bravado stripped away by the old man who had moved like no janitor they had ever seen. The storm outside beat against the glass, thunder rolling again as if echoing the inevitable. Rex's grin was gone now, replaced with a tight sneer that tried to mask the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You think this is over?" he spat, voice sharp enough to slice through the silence. He stepped forward, boots splashing through water left by Sam's mop, his shoulders squared as though rage alone could make him stronger. "You're nothing but bones and dust. I'll finish you myself." Sam stood still, his breathing calm, his eyes locked on the man who had terrorized Millstone for weeks. He didn't adjust his stance, didn't shift his weight, didn't even raise his hands yet. His silence unnerved Rex more than any taunt could have. Around them, the passengers and townsfolk pressed back against the walls, holding their breath. Even the bikers who could still stand stayed frozen, their eyes darting between their leader and the janitor who had dismantled them one by one. Rex roared and lunged, swinging the chain high, aiming to smash it across Sam's skull. But Sam moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed such moments his entire life. He stepped inside the arc of the chain, his left hand catching Rex's wrist mid-swing while his right hand snapped upward, striking the underside of Rex's jaw with a sharp, controlled blow. The sound cracked in the silence, a reminder of how fast discipline could overcome brute strength. Rex staggered but recovered, spitting blood, swinging again with desperation. Sam ducked low, his shoulder pressing into Rex's chest, his hand twisting the chain loose with a clean, practiced motion. In seconds, the weapon clattered to floor. The gang gasped, the sound carrying like a collective realization that their leader's strength was nothing against the stillness of a soldier. Rex tried to grab Sam, his fists wild now, his strikes sloppy. Sam caught one, redirected the force, and sent Rex spinning with his own momentum. A swift kick to the back of his knee buckled him, and before he could recover, Sam's hand was at his collar, dragging him down. He hit the tiles hard, air rushing from his lungs in a choked groan. The mop handle lay nearby, but Sam didn't need it. His grip alone was enough to keep Rex pinned. The mockery that had filled the station for days was gone. Silence pressed against the walls, broken only by the patter of rain and Rex's ragged breathing. The outlaw leader struggled, cursing, thrashing, but Sam's hold never wavered. He leaned close, his voice low, steady, unshaken. "You should have walked away when you had the chance." Rex froze, the fight in him draining as he looked up into eyes that had seen worse than he could ever imagine. For the first time, fear flickered across his face. The man he had called useless, the janitor he had mocked, had dismantled him in seconds, leaving him sprawled before his own crew. Sam released him suddenly, letting him collapse fully onto the floor. Rex gasped, coughing, scrambling back against the bench. The gang watched in silence, their confidence shattering as they saw their leader reduced to nothing more than a man trembling before the one they had underestimated. No one laughed now. No one dared move. The janitor stood tall, shoulders squared, the stormlight flashing across his lined face. Samuel Kincaid hadn't raised his voice, hadn't gloated, hadn't needed to. His actions alone told the story. The leader of the Iron Vultures had fallen, and he had fallen to man they thought was invisible. For the first time, the balance in Millstone shifted, and every outlaw still standing understood that nothing they could do would change it back. The storm had begun to ease by the time Sheriff Clara Boone pulled her cruiser up to the bus station. Rain still streaked the windows. Thunder still muttered in the distance. But the fury of the night had passed. What waited inside the station, however, was a different kind of storm, one that no weather could match. Clara stepped to the glass doors with her hand near her holster, prepared for chaos, for violence still in motion. Instead, she found silence. The station floor was a battlefield, though no gun had been fired. Benches were overturned, tiles cracked, water slicking the ground where buckets had spilled. The outlaws lay scattered across the floor and against the walls, groaning, clutching injuries, their weapons, chains, bats, knives, discarded in twisted heaps. The gang that had brought Millstone to its knees was broken, their bravado stripped, their dominance undone. Clara stopped in her tracks, her eyes sweeping across the wreckage, disbelief tightening in her chest. At the center of it all stood Samuel Kincaid. He was not panting, not flush with victory. He stood steady, his mop in hand, its handle resting lightly against the bucket beside him. His shirt was damp with sweat, his gray hair plastered against his forehead. But his eyes were calm, his posture as unshaken as if he'd been finishing his nightly rounds. To anyone who didn't know better, it looked like he had simply cleaned up after a mess. But to Clara, and everyone else gathering now at the doors, that calmness revealed something far greater. Eli Carter was the first of the townsfolk to step inside, his sneakers squeaking against the wet tile. He froze when he saw the bikers sprawled like rag dolls, his breath catching in his throat. His gaze flicked to Sam, and for a moment the boy felt as though he were the only one who truly understood what had happened. He whispered, almost to himself, "Told you, he's not just a janitor." More townsfolk pressing behind him, hesitant at first, then bolder as they realized the danger had passed. Mothers held their children close. Old men tipped their caps, and the clerk who had cowered behind the counter stepped forward with trembling hands. Their eyes were wide, not with fear but with awe. They saw what had been done to the men who had terrorized them, and they saw who had done it. Clara's hand dropped from her holster, though her pulse still raced. She moved closer, her boots crunching over broken glass. "Sam," she said softly, her voice carrying into the quiet. He looked at her, his pale eyes steady, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. The scene spoke for him. The defeated bikers shifted weakly, their pride broken as much as their bodies. Even Rex Dalton, who had once strutted at the head of his crew, sat slumped against a bench, his jaw bruised, his hands empty. He did not meet anyone's gaze. The gang that had declared the station, theirs now lay at the feet of the man they had mocked. The crowd began to murmur, whispers growing louder, turning into words passed from one mouth to another. He saved them. He fought them all. The janitor, he's a soldier. The phrase rippled through the station, a current of truth that could no longer be hidden. Sam finally lifted the mop, dipping it into the bucket as though the broken men around him were nothing more than another mess to clean. He wrung it out with care, pressed it against the tile, and began to wipe the blood and water from the floor. The act was so ordinary, so deliberate, that it silenced the crowd again. It was his way of saying he had not changed, that he was still who he had chosen to be, even if the truth had been revealed. Clara watched him, the weight of her badge heavy on her chest. She knew now that she had misjudged him, that the strength she had thought fragile was deeper than she could imagine. She also knew the town had just witnessed something it would never forget. Samuel Kincaid had stood against the iron vultures and broken them, not with noise or rage, but with precision, discipline, and silence. Eli's voice rose above the quiet, not loud but certain. "He's the reason they're gone. He's the reason we're safe." The boy's words carried farther than he realized, settling into the hearts of everyone listening. For the first time in weeks, Millstone felt free. And through it all, Sam kept mopping, his calm presence at the center of the wreckage a reminder that he had not fought for recognition. He had fought because it was necessary. The town might see him as their savior now, but to Sam, he was still just a man with the mop, cleaning up after storms, as he always had. The bus station smelled of rain and smoke when morning came, the storm finally giving way to a pale gray dawn. The broken glass had been swept into piles, the overturned benches set upright again, but the scars of the night remained. Water stains marked the walls where the fire had lit too close, and the air still carried the metallic tang of fear turned into memory. The townsfolk had gone back to their homes, whispering their stories behind closed doors, but the silence that lingered in Millstone was not one of dread anymore. It was a silence born of relief, stitched with awe. Sheriff Clara Boone stood in her office, hat on her desk, staring at the man seated across from her. Samuel Kincaid sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes as unreadable as ever. He had agreed to come only after the crowd thinned, only after the last outlaw had been dragged to holding, battered but alive. Clara had seen many things in her years wearing the badge, But never a night like this. The town she had sworn to protect had been saved not by sirens or guns, but by an old janitor who had moved like a ghost of war. She leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "Who are you, really?" Sam didn't answer right away. He reached into the bag at his side, pulled out a small cloth bundle, and set it gently on the desk between them. Clara watched as he unwrapped it, her breath catching when the faded Green Beret came into view. Its edges were worn, the color dull by years, but its shape carried a weight that needed no explanation. The patch sewn on its side was frayed but unmistakable, a symbol of men trained to fight in silence, men who went where others would not. Clara reached out, but stopped short of touching it. She didn't need to. The beret spoke louder than any confession could. She looked up at him, eyes narrowing as understanding settled in. "You were special forces," she said, though it came more as a statement than a question. Sam nodded once, his face calm. "A long time ago." The office was quiet except for the faint hum of the radio on her desk. Clara wanted to press him, to ask about the medals she had seen, the voices on the transceiver, the scars he carried. But she knew the answers wouldn't come. Some stories were meant to remain unspoken, sealed in the silence of men who had lived them. She let out a breath, leaning back in her chair. Why hide it? Why spend your life pushing a mop when you could have? She stopped herself, realizing the futility of the question. His eyes told her what words never could. He had seen enough of war, enough of recognition, enough of everything. A mop and a bucket were not weakness to him. They were peace. Sam stood, placing the beret back in its cloth wrap, tucking it away once more. He gave her a faint nod before turning toward the door. Clara watched him go, the weight of her badge feeling strangely lighter in his presence. He had done what she could not, and yet he asked for nothing in return. Not power, not thanks, not even recognition. Back at the bus station, the mop waited where he had left it, leaning against the wall beside the bucket. Sam picked it up, dipping it into fresh water, and began to work across the tiles. His shoulders bent as before, his strokes slow and steady. To anyone passing through, it looked no different than it always had. An old janitor keeping the floors clean. But the town would never see him the same again. They knew now what he had been, what he still was, even if he never spoke of it. The floor gleamed faintly in the morning light as Samuel Kincaid moved in silence, a soldier hidden once more, leaving only the sound of water against tile to mark his place in the world.